For 3 years she was the ghost in his mansion, a debt wife, hidden in plain sight, ignored by the man who thought he owned her. At a high-stakes underworld summit, surrounded by the most dangerous men in the country, Keisha Vance stood 2 steps behind the ruthless patriarch, Salvatore Marcello. To the room, she was just a beautiful accessory, silent and submissive. But while Salvatore toasted to his absolute power, Keisha was mentally counting his offshore accounts and memorizing the faces of his enemies. In one night of cold calculation, the woman he treated like a shadow began the methodical destruction of his heart and his billion-dollar empire, proving that the most dangerous enemy is the one you never bother to look at. Keisha Vance was never meant to be a queen. She was a transaction, sold into a marriage with the 68-year-old Salvatore Marcello to settle her father's gambling debts. She learned quickly that survival meant being still, being quiet, and being invisible. In the cold marble halls of the Marcello estate, she was a prisoner in silk, a young black woman trapped in a world of old-world violence and the patriarch's absolute neglect. But Salvatore made a fatal mistake. He assumed her silence was weakness. While he spent his days expanding a global mafia network with iron-fisted cruelty, Keisha spent her nights becoming a ghost in his machine. She studied his ledgers. She mapped his supply lines. She learned the digital keys to the wealth he thought was untouchable. She lived for the moments he looked right through her, because every time he ignored her, he gave her another piece of the puzzle she needed to dismantle him. Tonight, a public humiliation at a family funeral becomes the final spark. The debt wife is about to become the architect of a total empire collapse. This is a story of calculated revenge, the arrogance of power, and a woman who waited 3 years to prove that when you take everything from someone, they are finally free to take everything from you. The marble floors of the Marcello estate were as cold as the man who owned them. Keisha moved through the cavernous hallways with a silence that had become her second language. In this house, sound was a liability. To be heard was to be noticed, and to be noticed by Salvatore, the patriarch, Marcello was to invite a scrutiny that felt like a blade against the throat. She caught her reflection in a gilded mirror, a young woman in a dress that cost more than her father's life, her skin a deep, rich contrast against the pale Italian stone. Her posture was perfect, her expression a mask of porcelain dignity, but behind her eyes, a ledger was constantly being updated. Salvatore was in the study, the heavy oak doors thrown open just enough for his gravelly voice to bleed into the corridor. He was discussing the port shipments in Jersey, his tone dismissive as he spoke to his capos. To him, Keisha was merely a piece of fine furniture he had acquired 3 years ago, a living receipt for a debt her father could never pay. When she passed the doorway, he didn't even look up. He didn't see the way her hands smoothed the silk of her skirt, nor did he notice the slight pause in her step as she memorized the name of the union leader he was threatening. The silence of the house was suffocating, yet it was within this vacuum that Keisha had found her strength. In the beginning, the neglect had been a source of searing pain, a reminder of her worthlessness in this world of blood and old money. She had spent the first year weeping in the dark, waiting for a husband who only appeared when he wanted a silent companion for a formal dinner. But the pain had eventually hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. She walked into the library, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and expensive tobacco. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where the loose floorboard rested beneath the Persian rug. As she knelt, her movements were fluid and practiced. She pulled out a small, encrypted laptop, the heart of her counter-empire. While Salvatore believed she was spending her afternoons at boutiques or galleries, Keisha was tracing the digital fingerprints of his offshore shell companies. She was a ghost in his machine, a shadow that had learned to navigate the dark corners of his greed. As the screen's blue light illuminated her face, her expression wasn't one of a victim, but of a predator. Salvatore had ignored her for 3 years, assuming she was too young, too broken, and too other to understand his world. It was his greatest mistake. He had given her the greatest gift a spy could ask for, the freedom of being completely underestimated. Tonight, the silence was still her shield, but soon it would become his shroud. The heavy oak doors of the Marcello estate didn't just open, they groaned, as if the house itself were weary of the secrets it held. Keisha stepped into the grand foyer, the click of her heels swallowed by the thick Persian rugs. The air inside always felt 5 degrees colder, scented with expensive cigar smoke and the metallic tang of old history. At the end of the hall, framed by the amber glow of a single crystal chandelier, sat Salvatore. He didn't look up from his glass of vintage scotch. To the world, he was the patriarch, a man whose nod could stabilize a market or end a life. To Keisha, he was a wall of ice. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely cut through the silence. He didn't offer a greeting, didn't ask how her day had been, and certainly didn't acknowledge the rain that had dampened her hair. Keisha stood perfectly still, her posture a masterpiece of restrained dignity. The driver was delayed by the gala traffic, Salvatore. He finally raised his eyes, piercing steel-gray orbs that looked at her not as a wife, but as a line item in a ledger. A Marcello is never delayed. It suggests a lack of control, and in this house, control is the only thing that keeps us breathing. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze trailing off to a shadow in the corner where one of his many silent enforcers stood. "I'll remember that," Keisha replied softly. She moved to hang her coat, but he stopped her with a flick of his wrist. "Don't bother. We have guests arriving in an hour. Dress in the black silk I bought you. Stay in the background, keep the wine flowing, and for God's sake, Keisha, don't speak unless a direct question is put to you. These men are here for business, not for the company of a debt wife." The term stung, a sharp needle pressed into a bruise that never quite healed. He spoke it with such casual indifference, as if reminding her of her price was a routine chore. He turned back to his papers, effectively erasing her from the room. Keisha felt the familiar surge of restrained emotional pain, a heat in her chest that she quickly cooled with the icy logic she had spent 3 years perfecting. She looked at his bent head, the silver hair reflecting the light, and for the first time, she didn't feel the sting of his rejection. She felt the thrill of his blindness. He thought he was giving her a cold welcome to his world, but he was actually giving her exactly what she needed, a front row seat to his vulnerabilities. As she turned to climb the marble staircase, her expression remained a mask of submission, but her mind was already elsewhere, cataloging the names of the guests he had mentioned and wondering which of them would be the first to help her burn his house down. The silence in the Marcello estate was not the peaceful kind. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that Keisha Vance had learned to wear like a second skin. For 3 years, she had lived within these gold-leafed walls as a ghost in a silk nightgown. Salvatore never struck her. That would have required him to acknowledge her presence as a human being. Instead, he simply looked through her, his eyes moving over her form as if she were just another piece of expensive Renaissance furniture he had acquired in a tax-deductible auction. To the world, she was the secret prize of the patriarch, a young woman plucked from the chaos of the city to live in an ivory tower. But Keisha knew the truth of her title. She was a human receipt. Her marriage was the ink that dried on her father's debt cancellation papers. In the beginning, she had tried. She had prepared meals he never ate, worn dresses he never complimented, and offered opinions on art and music that he silenced with a single, dismissive wave of a hand. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a placeholder that satisfied the traditional Sicilian image of a domestic life. As the months bled into years, Keisha's restrained emotional pain crystallized into something sharper, a quiet, dignified resolve. She stopped seeking his gaze and started seeking his secrets, while Salvatore sat in his study. Shrouded in the smoke of expensive cigars and the shadows of his own cruelty, Keisha became an expert in the art of the empty room. She learned that men like Salvatore speak freely when they think the person beside them has no mind to understand. She spent her afternoons in the library, not reading poetry, but studying the rhythm of his movements. She learned which floorboards in the West Wing creaked and which digital archives he accessed when he thought she was asleep. She watched the way his lieutenants shifted their weight when they were lying, and the way the color drained from his face when a specific rival's name was mentioned. Every dismissal, every night spent alone in her cold, king-sized bed, was a lesson. He thought he was hiding her from the world to protect his reputation, but he was actually giving her the perfect vantage point. From the shadows, she saw the rot in his foundation. She saw the fear he mistook for loyalty. Underneath her calm, mask-like expression, Keisha was no longer the frightened girl who had walked down a lonely aisle. She was a silent architect, meticulously mapping the fortress of a man who didn't even realize he was under siege. Salvatore Marcello had mastered the underworld, but he had failed to master his own home, never realizing that the most dangerous weapon in his empire was the woman he had taught to be invisible. The heavy, mahogany doors of the Marcello ancestral estate swung open, exhaling the scent of expensive cigars and ancient grudges. Salvatore walked several paces ahead, his stride purposeful and predatory, while Keisha followed at the mandatory distance required by his unspoken protocol. Tonight was the funeral of one of the Commission's founding members, an event where the hierarchy of the underworld was on full display. As they entered the grand hall, the air grew thick with the judgment of 100 silent eyes. Salvatore didn't slow down to offer Keisha his arm or even a glance of acknowledgement. He moved through the crowd like a king returning to his throne, shaking hands with men whose rings cost more than a common man's life. Keisha stood near the periphery, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture a masterpiece of restrained dignity. She wore a black veil that partially obscured her face, a shield against the pitying looks of the other mafia wives who knew exactly what she was, a trophy kept in a cold box. The humiliation didn't come with a shout, but with a whisper. Salvatore was deep in conversation with a rival boss from the West Coast, a man who looked at Keisha with a hunger that was both insulting and dangerous. When the man gestured toward her, asking why Salvatore had never introduced his beautiful young bride to the inner circle, Salvatore didn't even turn his head. "She is a debt paid, nothing more," Salvatore's voice rang out, cold and metallic, cutting through the low hum of the string quartet. "A man does not introduce his receipts to his business partners. She is here to occupy space and maintain the silence I require. Beyond that, she has no name in this room." A few of the younger capos chuckled, a dry, cruel sound that echoed against the marble. Keisha felt the heat of the blood rising to her cheeks, the sting of 1,000 needles under her skin. She looked at Salvatore, really looked at him, and saw the silver-haired patriarch for exactly what he was, a man blinded by the glare of his own legend. She didn't cry. She didn't lower her head. Instead, her eyes narrowed, capturing the cinematic play of shadows across the room. She watched him turn his back on her to discuss a new shipping route, completely unaware that he had just handed her the final piece of her resolve. In that moment of public dismissal, the debt wife died, and the saboteur was born. Keisha took a steady breath, the scent of the funeral lilies suddenly smelling like the beginning of a long-awaited end. She wasn't just standing apart from him anymore. She was already a world away, plotting the exact coordinates of his fall. If he wanted her to be a ghost, she would be exactly that, the kind that haunts a man until there is nothing left of his world but dust and regret. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the heavy silence of the Marcello estate was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock, Keisha Vance moved like a phantom. To Salvatore, she was merely a decorative fixture of his life, a woman who existed to fill the seat across from him at dinner and remain silent while he brokered deals of blood and billions. He never noticed the way her eyes lingered on his briefcase, or the way she moved through the study with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to breathe without making a sound. Tonight, the study door groaned softly as she pushed it open. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and old leather, the scent of the patriarch's undisputed reign. Salvatore was asleep in the master wing, confident in his security systems and his terrifying reputation. He believed no one would dare touch his private affairs. He was right about his enemies, but he was fatally wrong about his wife. Keisha sat at the massive mahogany desk, the glow from a small, shielded penlight illuminating the leather-bound ledger Salvatore kept for his true accounts. It was an archaic method for a billionaire, but Salvatore was a man of the old world. He trusted paper more than servers that could be hacked. He didn't realize that the greatest threat wasn't a digital virus, but the woman he had spent 3 years ignoring. As she turned the pages, her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She wasn't just looking for numbers. She was looking for the soul of his empire. Her eyes scanned the columns of figures, untraceable wire transfers to shell companies in Cyprus, consulting fees paid to corrupt senators, and the chillingly brief notes on shipments that never appeared on any official manifest. To anyone else, it was a mess of codes and ciphers. To Keisha, it was a map. For 3 years, she had meticulously educated herself, reading between the lines of his phone calls and cross-referencing the names he dropped like discarded cigarette butts. She began to see the fractures. She found the ghost, accounts, funds set aside for emergencies that even his underbosses didn't know existed. With a miniature camera, she captured the images of each page, the shutter click sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. She felt a cold, sharp thrill. Salvatore saw a submissive girl who had been bought to pay a debt. He didn't see the auditor of his soul. Every photograph was a brick removed from the foundation of his palace. She wasn't just stealing his money. She was harvesting the evidence that would ensure he could never rebuild. By the time the first gray light of morning touched the heavy velvet curtains, the ledger was back in its drawer, exactly 3 millimeters from the edge, just as he left it. Keisha slipped back into the hallway, her expression once again masking the fire within. The patriarch's empire was still standing, but in the dark, a ghost had already begun to tear it down. The silence of the Marcello estate was never empty. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, built of stone walls and secrets. For Salvatore, that silence was a sign of his absolute control. For Keisha, it had become her greatest ally. It started with a single shipment of vintage Tuscan wine, a legitimate front for a much darker transaction. Under the flickering light of her laptop in the dead of night, Keisha didn't just watch the numbers. She moved them. With the precision of a surgeon, she rerouted the digital manifests, sending the shipment to a warehouse in a district controlled by the Morty family, Salvatore's most volatile rivals. It was a small deviation, a minor glitch, in a system that had run perfectly for 40 years. The next morning, the tension in the breakfast room was thick enough to choke. Salvatore sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his tailored suit jacket draped over his chair, exposing the silver-threaded vest that marked his status as the patriarch. He was staring at his encrypted phone, his brow furrowed in a rare display of agitation. "Is something wrong, Salvatore?" Keisha asked softly. She sat at the opposite end, her posture dignified and her expression a mask of gentle concern. She looked exactly like the quiet, broken girl he had bought, a shadow that didn't dare to speak unless spoken to. He didn't even look up. To him, her voice was just background noise, no more significant than the hum of the air conditioning. "A clerical error," he muttered, his voice a low growl of gravel and ice. "A captain's incompetence. I'll have it handled by noon." But noon came and went, and the clerical error snowballed. By late afternoon, the phone calls from the docks became frantic. The Mortys had seized the shipment, taking it as an act of war. Salvatore's lieutenants were panicking, unable to explain how the GPS tracking had failed or why the digital signatures belonged to Salvatore's personal terminal. Keisha watched it all from the mezzanine, standing slightly apart in the deep shadows of the hallway. From this height, the powerful men in the foyer looked small, like chess pieces scattered by a careless hand. She watched Salvatore, usually so composed, packing the marble floor, his movements sharp and jagged with burgeoning fury. He was looking for a traitor among his soldiers, someone with a gun and a motive. He never once looked toward the mezzanine. He never looked at the woman who had spent 3 years learning the language of his machines, while he treated her as a piece of furniture. The crack was small, nearly invisible, but the foundation was finally moaning under the weight of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting high-contrast, cinematic shadows across the mansion, Keisha felt a cold, sharp spark of resolve. The patriarch's empire wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on the fear of a man who thought he saw everything. He was about to learn that the most dangerous view is the one from the shadow. The shadows in Salvatore's study were long and cold, cast by the flicker of a dying fire that he was too preoccupied to tend. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a fortress of a man in a three-piece suit, his eyes narrowed at a screen of plummeting stock options and disrupted shipments. To him, the woman entering the room with a crystal decanter of scotch was merely a part of the architecture, a silent, graceful fixture of his domestic life. He didn't even look up as Keisha set the glass down, her fingers grazing the edge of his leather blotter with a touch as light as a breath. "You're late with the drink, Keisha," he muttered, his voice a gravelly rasp of irritation. "My apologies, Salvatore," she replied softly, her voice the perfect mask of submissive regret. She stood slightly apart from him, her posture upright and dignified, her eyes fixed on the heavy velvet curtains rather than the man who held her life in his hands. He dismissed her with a sharp wave of his hand, already turning back to a secure phone line to bark orders at a captain in Chicago. He didn't notice that as Keisha turned to leave, her hand dipped into the pocket of her silk robe, concealing a small, encrypted burner phone. Once inside the sanctuary of the darkened hallway, Keisha's expression shifted. The restrained emotional pain that usually defined her face hardened into something sharp and surgical. She retreated to the small conservatory at the end of the east wing, a place Salvatore never visited because it smelled too much of growth and not enough of gunpowder. With practiced, steady thumbs, she began to type. She wasn't just sending messages, she was breathing life into a ghost. Her recipient was Julian Vane, Salvatore's most ambitious rival, a man who had been looking for a chink in the patriarch's armor for a decade. "The shipment in Port Newark isn't carrying textiles," she typed, the blue light of the screen illuminating the cold resolve in her eyes. "Check the secondary hull of the Crest View. The manifest is a lie. The codes change at midnight." She paused, a momentary flicker of the girl she used to be, the one who hoped for a real marriage, ghosting across her features. But then she remembered the funeral, the way Salvatore had stepped over her grief as if it were a common puddle, and her heart turned back to stone. "He thinks he is untouchable," she added, her thumb hovering over the send button. "Show him that he is made of glass." With a single tap, the whisper was released. It was a digital betrayal, a silent strike delivered from the heart of his own home. As the sent notification blinked, Keisha looked out the window at the sprawling, dark estate. The empire looked grand, but she knew the truth. She had just pulled the first thread, and the entire tapestry was about to unravel. She wasn't a wife tonight. She was the architect of a ruin he would never see coming. In the weeks following the public humiliation at the funeral, Keisha perfected the performance of the broken woman. She moved through the Marcello estate with a calculated limp in her spirit, her eyes perpetually downcast, her voice never rising above a whisper. To Salvatore, she was finally a finished product, a wife so thoroughly crushed by his indifference that she no longer possessed the will to even look him in the eye. He found her docility boring, and in his boredom he stopped closing doors. While Salvatore conducted meetings in the grand study, the air thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the stench of corruption, Keisha became a fixture of the background. She was the one who placed the crystal glass of scotch at his elbow. She was the one who silently refreshed the ice while he discussed the shipment routes of the port of Savannah. To the men in that room, she was no more significant than the mahogany furniture. They spoke of numbers, of bribes, and of the harvest, the massive movement of untraceable funds scheduled for the quarter's end. They never noticed the way her hand remained steady, or how her mind, sharp as a razor, was cataloging every name and every decimal point. Late at night, when the mansion fell into a tomb-like silence and Salvatore's rhythmic, heavy snoring echoed from the master suite, Keisha's second life began. In the dim glow of a burner phone hidden inside the lining of an old jewelry box, she became the architect of his ruin. She didn't just steal money. She moved it into ghost accounts that appeared to belong to Salvatore's most ambitious underbosses. She was planting seeds of paranoia that would soon bloom into a civil war. She spent hours in the library, ostensibly dusting the leather-bound books Salvatore never read. In reality, she was using a handheld scanner to digitize the physical ledgers he kept as a fail-safe against digital tracking. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird every time she heard a footstep in the hall, but her face remained a mask of marble. The restrained emotional pain he saw was actually the grueling tension of a woman walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Keisha realized that the greatest advantage of being ignored was the access it granted. Salvatore had built a fortress to keep his enemies out, never realizing he had locked his most dangerous adversary inside with him. She wasn't just waiting for her freedom anymore. She was designing the explosion that would buy it. Every time she endured his dismissive touch or a cold command, she added another zero to the amount she was draining from his legacy. She was no longer a victim of the Marcello name. She was the virus that would eventually bring the entire system to its knees. Salvatore Marcello sat in his leather-bound study, the amber liquid in his crystal glass catching the dim, cinematic glow of the fireplace. To him, the world was a chessboard he had already won. He stared at a monitor displaying the security feeds of his vast estate, his eyes skimming over Keisha as she moved through the garden. To Salvatore, she was little more than a piece of fine sculpture, beautiful, silent, and entirely stationary in the grand design of his life. He took a slow sip of scotch, the burn of familiar comfort. His arrogance was not a loud, boisterous thing. It was a cold, impenetrable suit of armor. He had spent 68 years mastering the art of the crush, and he truly believed that by marrying Keisha, he had simply acquired another asset to be managed and eventually forgotten. In his mind, her youth was a synonym for ignorance, and her heritage made her an outsider who would never understand the complex mechanics of the Marcello legacy. "She is a quiet one, isn't she?" His consigliere, Lorenzo, remarked from the shadows of the doorway, nodding toward the screen. Salvatore didn't even turn his head. A thin, dismissive smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Silence is the only thing she has to offer, Lorenzo. She knows her place. She is the debt paid, the contract signed. She lacks the blood for this life, let alone the mind to navigate it." He leaned back, the shadows stretching across his weathered face, deepening the lines of a man who believed himself a god. He began to discuss the upcoming expansion into the shipping ports, his voice heavy with the certainty of a king. He spoke of encrypted servers and ironclad ledgers as if they were holy relics that no one else could touch. He never noticed that on the screen, Keisha had paused by the fountain, her reflection sharp and unwavering in the water. He didn't see the way her posture shifted, not with the slump of the defeated, but with the calculated grace of a predator measuring the distance to its prey. Salvatore's greatest weakness was his pride. He was so blinded by his own legend that he couldn't see the fire beginning to catch at the edges of his curtains. He treated the secret wife as a shadow, forgetting that shadows are born from light and grow longest just before the sun sets. As he laughed at a cold joke about his rival's incompetence, he was blissfully unaware that the woman he dismissed as a transaction had already memorized his most private codes. He was a man standing on a pedestal of glass, mocking the ground, never realizing that the first cracks were already forming beneath his very feet. The digital clock on the bedside table flickered to 12:00 a.m., its pale blue glow cutting through the oppressive silence of the Marcello master suite. Beside Keisha, Salvatore slept the heavy, arrogant sleep of a man who believed his world was impenetrable. His breathing was rhythmic, a low, raspy sound that once intimidated her but now only served as a metronome for her mission. Moving with the practiced grace of a shadow, Keisha slipped from the silk sheets. She didn't head for the door, she headed for the vanity. Hidden behind a false backing in her jewelry box sat a slim, encrypted tablet, a device Salvatore's own tech specialists had overlooked during their sweep, assuming his young wife spent her time browsing fashion blogs. She sat on the floor in the walk-in closet, the designer gowns hanging like colorful ghosts around her. The screen illuminated her face, highlighting the sharp resolve in her eyes. This was the moment of no return. For months, she had been mapping the Hydra accounts, the untraceable offshore nodes Salvatore used to fund his private security and bribe the city's judiciary. Her fingers danced across the glass. She wasn't just stealing money, she was severing his nervous system. The first transfer was the largest, $40 million diverted from a Cayman shell company into a series of decentralized crypto wallets she had established under a dozen different identities. As the progress bar crawled forward, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She glanced toward the bedroom. If he woke up now, there would be no explanation, no lie that could save her. In the Marcello world, this wasn't just theft. It was high treason. 90%, 95% complete. A cold shiver of triumph raced down her spine. She watched as the digital balance of the patriarch's primary reserve plummeted to zero. To the world, Salvatore Marcello was still a billionaire, but on the back end, he was now a man standing on a hollow foundation. She didn't stop there. She began the midnight transfer of data, encrypted files containing the coordinates of his secret warehouses and the digital signatures of his latest shipments, sending them to an anonymous tip line at the Federal Bureau. As the final file sent, Keisha closed the tablet and tucked it back into its velvet hiding place. She walked back to the bed and lay down, her body inches away from the man who had ignored her for 3 years. She looked at his sleeping face, the face of a ruthless king who didn't realize his crown had just turned to ash. Keisha closed her eyes, not out of fear, but out of a new, terrifying peace. The ghost was gone. The architect had arrived. The digital glow of the tablet screen was the only light in Keisha's private dressing room, casting long, sharp shadows against the silk-paneled walls. Outside the heavy oak doors, the Marcello estate was humming with the low, rhythmic preparations for Salvatore's Sapphire Jubilee, a celebration of 40 years of undisputed rule. But inside this small sanctuary, Keisha was orchestrating his retirement. She scrolled through the encrypted files one last time. It was all there. The shadow companies, the laundered construction bids, and the precise coordinates of the offshore servers in the Cayman Islands that Salvatore believed were invisible to the world. To him, Keisha was a quiet girl who spent her afternoons reading poetry and arranging lilies. He never suspected that while she sat at the edge of his mahogany desk, she was memorizing the reflection of his keystrokes in the polished surface of his silver fountain pen. Her fingers hovered over the send icon. This wasn't just data, it was a gift. She had spent months carefully curating this package for the one person Salvatore feared more than the feds, Riccardo Morti, his most ambitious rival. By tomorrow, the Marcello supply lines would be intercepted, and the loyalty of Salvatore's captains would evaporate as their private bank accounts began to bleed dry. A heavy knock echoed through the room, and Keisha didn't flinch. She swiped the screen dark and slipped the tablet into the hidden compartment of her vanity just as Salvatore entered. He looked every bit the patriarch, his tailored charcoal suit flawless, his silver hair swept back with practiced precision. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the diamond necklace resting on the velvet bust in front of her. "Wear the sapphires tonight, Keisha," he commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp of cold authority. "I want the world to see how well I provide for what is mine." He stepped closer, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. To any observer, it was a gesture of affection. To Keisha, it was the weight of a gilded cage. He leaned down, his breath cold against her ear. "Don't look so somber. It's a night for celebration." "Of course, Salvatore," she whispered, her voice like silk over glass. She looked at his reflection in the mirror, the aging predator who had no idea he was already caught in a web of his own making. As he turned to leave, satisfied by her submission, Keisha reached back into the vanity. With a single, steady tap, she hit send. The data vanished into the ether, a silent explosion set to detonate in the heart of his empire. She picked up the heavy sapphire necklace, the stones cold and blue like a frozen sea. Salvatore thought he was dressing his wife in jewels. He didn't realize he was actually wrapping himself in treason. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in 3 years, Keisha Vance felt the intoxicating warmth of true power. The morning sun didn't rise over the Marcello estate. It bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble foyer. Keisha stood on the mezzanine, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Below, the heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were breached. The rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots replaced the usual silence of the house. A dozen agents in windbreakers emblazoned with gold letters swarmed the entryway, their faces as stony as the statues Salvatore collected. Lead Agent Miller stepped forward, a warrant held out like a death sentence. Salvatore descended the grand staircase with a slow, predatory grace, his silk robe billowing behind him. He looked every bit the patriarch, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression one of bored annoyance rather than fear. "Do you have any idea whose home you are violating?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that usually made men tremble. "We have a very good idea, Mr. Marcello," Miller replied, unfazed. "We're here for the physical ledgers and the server access for the offshore logistics. We have credible evidence of systematic racketeering and capital flight." From her vantage point, Keisha watched the muscles in Salvatore's jaw tighten. He turned his head slightly, his gaze catching hers for a fleeting second. Even now, in the middle of a federal raid, his eyes were dismissive. He looked at her not as a partner to be protected, but as a piece of furniture that happened to be in the line of sight. He gave a sharp, infinitesimal nod, a silent command for her to go back to her room and stay out of the way of men's business. Keisha didn't blink. She lowered her head in a practiced show of submission, the restrained emotional pain visible in the curve of her shoulders. But beneath the mask, her heart beat with a cold, rhythmic triumph. She was the credible evidence. 2 weeks ago, she had hand-delivered the encryption keys to a dead drop in Battery Park. She had been the one to highlight the discrepancies in the shipping manifest that Miller was currently seizing. As the agents began boxing up Salvatore's life, Keisha felt the weight of her 3-year sentence beginning to lift. Salvatore barked orders at his lawyers over a burner phone, his arrogance still shielding him from the truth. He truly believed this was just another glitch, a temporary nuisance he could buy or bully his way out of. He had no idea that the foundation of his empire hadn't been cracked from the outside. It had been dismantled from within, by the woman he didn't think was smart enough to understand the word ledger. As an agent moved toward the library, Salvatore's face finally flickered with a shadow of unease. He looked up at Keisha again, seeking the comfort of her unwavering, silent presence. This time, she didn't look away. She simply took a slow, deliberate sip of her cold tea, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that should have terrified him. The harvest had begun. Salvatore Marcello sat in his study, a room lined with dark mahogany and the heavy scent of vintage tobacco, but for the first time in 40 years the walls felt like they were closing in. He was a man who ruled by the divine right of fear, yet a new, cold draft had entered his sanctuary. It wasn't a physical threat. No assassins had breached the gates, but something far more insidious. A glitch in the machine, a ghost in the wires. He stared at the computer screen, his weathered fingers hovering over the keys. $2 million had vanished from a shell company in the Cayman Islands. It wasn't the amount that troubled him. It was the surgical precision of the withdrawal. It had been moved using a secondary authorization code, a code known only to him and his most trusted underboss, who had been dead for 6 months. "Who is breathing my air?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice a raspy growl. The patriarch rose, packing the length of the Persian rug. He looked out the window at the sprawling gardens of his estate, where security guards moved like silent chess pieces in the moonlight. He had always been the hunter, the one who saw the move before it was made. But now he felt eyes on the back of his neck. Every phone call felt bugged. Every loyal soldier's smile looked like a mask for a blade. He suspected his rivals in the Morty family. He suspected the young, hungry captains in his own ranks. He even suspected the feds were finally playing a long game he couldn't see. He looked at the heavy oak door, half expecting his empire to crumble the moment it opened. Behind him, the door creaked. Salvatore spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the beretta tucked into the small of his back. It was only Keisha. She stood in the doorway, a vision of quiet elegance in a silk dressing gown, her expression unreadable. She held a tray with a single glass of scotch and a carafe of water. She didn't speak. She never did unless he commanded it. She simply walked to his desk, set the tray down, and began to adjust the stray papers he had scattered in his frantic search for the leak. Salvatore watched her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw only a young woman, a debt paid, a trophy acquired, a creature far too simple to understand the complexities of his world. He looked right through her, his mind already racing back to his ledgers, wondering which of his loyal men was betraying him. "Leave us," he snapped, dismissing her without a second thought. Keisha bowed her head slightly, her posture the picture of submission. As she turned to leave, the shadows of the room swallowed her silhouette. Salvatore didn't notice the faint, cold glint of triumph in her eyes, nor did he realize that the predator he was hunting was currently closing his door from the inside. The king was looking at the horizon for an army, never realizing the crown was already being dismantled by the hands that served his drink. The moon hung low over the Hudson River, casting a jagged, silver reflection on the water that mirrored the fractured state of Keisha's life. She stepped out of the black town car, her heels clicking against the damp pavement of a deserted pier. In the distance, the skyline of Manhattan glittered, a playground for men like Salvatore, men who thought they owned the air everyone else breathed. She pulled her wool coat tighter, not against the cold, but against the weight of the digital drive tucked into her inner pocket. This was the moment of no return. A figure emerged from the shadows of a rusted warehouse. It wasn't one of Salvatore's rivals or a street-level thug. It was Agent Miller, the man who had been chasing the Marcello shadow for a decade. He looked tired, his eyes weary from years of dead ends and silenced witnesses. He didn't speak until Keisha was feet away, her expression a mask of restrained, dignified pain. "I didn't think you'd come," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper against the lapping waves. "Most people who marry into that family eventually find a way to justify the blood on the floor." "I didn't marry into a family, Agent Miller," Keisha replied, her voice steady but cold as ice. "I was sold into a prison. There's a difference." She reached into her coat and produced the drive. It was small, silver, and held the encrypted keys to the Marcello shipping manifests, the ones Salvatore kept hidden even from his underbosses. To the world, these were just logistics. To the Department of Justice, they were a road map to 30 years of racketeering. Miller reached for it, but Keisha didn't let go immediately. Her eyes locked onto his, the cinematic high-contrast lighting of the pier emphasizing the sharp resolve in her gaze. "This isn't just about a conviction. I want his accounts drained. I want the offshore shell companies in the Caymans seized before he even knows the door is being kicked in. I want him to watch the walls crumble before he realizes I'm the one who pulled the foundation out." "You're playing a dangerous game, Keisha," Miller warned, finally taking the drive. "If he suspects even a breath of this, there won't be enough of you left to bury." "He won't suspect," she said, a small, bitter smile touching her lips. "He's too busy looking at himself in the mirror to notice the woman standing right behind him." As she turned to walk back to the car, the heavy silence of the pier felt like the calm before a hurricane. For 3 years she had been a ghost. Tonight she was the storm. She had spent her life believing she was powerless, but as she watched Miller disappear back into the darkness with Salvatore's life's work in his pocket, Keisha Vance finally felt the first spark of a terrifying, beautiful freedom. The patriarch was still sleeping, unaware that his empire had just been sold for the price of his own arrogance. The atmosphere inside the Marcello estate had shifted from cold to suffocating. Salvatore sat in his study, the patriarch looking every bit his 68 years as he stared at a flickering monitor. For the first time in his long, blood-stained career, he felt a ghost in his perimeter. A shipment of high-end circuitry had been seized in Marseille. A silent partner in Macau had suddenly stopped answering his calls. He leaned back, his luxury-tailored suit feeling like a straitjacket. He was looking for a monster, a rival Don, a federal mole, a turncoat lieutenant. He never once looked toward the door where Keisha stood. She entered silently, carrying a tray with his evening scotch. Her posture was, as always, restrained, the picture of the dutiful, quiet wife he had bought and paid for. She placed the glass on the mahogany desk, her expression a mask of dignified indifference. Salvatore didn't even glance at her. He was too busy barking orders into his encrypted phone, demanding to know who the traitor was. "They're bleeding me, Keisha," he growled, more to himself than to her, his voice rasping with a rare edge of panic. "Someone is inside the firewalls. Someone knows the ledger better than I do." Keisha stood slightly apart from him, her shadow stretching long across the Persian rug. She watched him, really watched him, and felt a flicker of the old pain, the memory of the young woman who had once hoped this powerful man might see her as a human being. But that girl was dead, buried under 3 years of his icy neglect. As he turned his back to pace the room, Keisha's hand hovered for a fraction of a second over his unlocked laptop. With a few keystrokes she had practiced 1,000 times in the dead of night, she initiated the final harvest. A series of encrypted files, evidence of a decade of racketeering, began their silent journey to an anonymous tip line at the Department of Justice. Simultaneously, the last of the Marcello offshore reserves began to drain into a constellation of untraceable accounts she had built over 3 years of being invisible. Salvatore turned around, his eyes bloodshot. "Why are you still standing there?" "Get out." Keisha didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her face a calm, cinematic landscape of hidden resolve. She was the traitor within, the wolf he had invited into his home and fed with his own arrogance. As she walked toward the door, she realized she was no longer afraid of the danger or the social pressure of the Marcello name. The empire was already dead. The patriarch just hadn't felt the cold yet. She closed the door behind her, leaving him alone in a room full of shadows that were finally beginning to close in. The digital walls Salvatore Marcello had built around his life were not crumbling. They were being surgically removed, piece by piece, by the woman sitting silently across from him at the breakfast table. To Salvatore, Keisha was merely a quiet presence in a silk robe, her eyes downcast as she sipped her tea. He didn't see the fire behind her calm facade, nor did he hear the silent alarms currently screaming in the ears of his lieutenants across the Atlantic. The bleeding began in the Mediterranean. A shipment of high-end logistics, the backbone of a 3-month operation, was seized by port authorities in Naples. It wasn't a lucky bust by the police. It was a tip-off so precise it included the serial numbers of the hidden containers. Salvatore's phone buzzed incessantly, a frantic rhythm of disaster that he attempted to ignore to maintain his patriarch composure. He felt a prickle of unease, a cold sweat beneath his tailored shirt. For the first time in 40 years, the wind was blowing against him. "Is everything all right, Salvatore?" Keisha asked, her voice like velvet, devoid of the fear he had grown accustomed to. He didn't look up from his encrypted tablet. "Business, Keisha, go back to your garden." He didn't notice the subtle curl of her lip. While he stared at the screen, watching his net worth dip by tens of millions in a single hour, Keisha was already onto the next phase. She had spent the last 3 years mapping the veins of his empire, the offshore shell companies in Panama, the silent partners in Macau, and the backroom deals that kept his legitimacy afloat. One by one, those veins were being opened. By noon, the bleeding reached the heart of his Manhattan interests. A whistleblower, anonymous, untraceable, and devastatingly well-informed, had dropped a digital bomb on the district attorney's desk. It wasn't just a list of crimes. It was a road map of the Marcello family's tax evasion and money laundering schemes spanning 2 decades. Salvatore stood in his study, the dramatic cinematic lighting of the room casting long, jagged shadows against the mahogany walls. The silence of the house felt heavy, suffocating. He poured himself a glass of vintage scotch, his hand trembling slightly. He was a man who understood war, but this wasn't a war of bullets and bravado. This was a ghost in his machine, a shadow that knew his every move before he made it. From the hallway, Keisha watched him through the crack of the door. The high-contrast light caught the sharp focus of her resolve. She saw the powerful billionaire, the patriarch, looking small for the first time in his life. He was bleeding out, and he still had no idea that the knife was in her hand. The empire was dying, and for Keisha, the air had never felt so clear. The silence of the Marcello estate had always been heavy, but tonight it felt like a burial shroud. Salvatore sat in his high-backed leather chair, the glow of a single desk lamp carving deep, tired canyons into his face. He looked every bit the 68-year-old man he was, a patriarch whose bones were beginning to feel the weight of the blood he had spilled to keep his throne. In the corner of the room, Keisha stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She was as she had always been, quiet, dignified, and perfectly still. "The accounts are frozen, Keisha," Salvatore rasped, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "The ports in Sicily, the warehouses in Jersey, it's as if the world simply stopped breathing for me today." Keisha didn't turn around. She watched her own reflection in the glass, the face of a woman who had spent 3 years learning how to mask the fire in her eyes. "Perhaps the world is tired of holding its breath for you, Salvatore," she said softly. He scoffed, a ghost of his former arrogance flickering in his chest. "It's a glitch, a traitor in the mid-levels. I'll find them. I'll make an example of them that will turn the Hudson red." "It's not a glitch," Keisha replied, finally turning to face him. Her posture was regal, her chin lifted with a strength he had never bothered to notice. "And you won't find a traitor among your men. They were loyal to the money, and the money is gone." As if on cue, the light on the desk flickered once and died. Then, the hum of the central air conditioning ceased. One by one, the distant lights of the mansion's security perimeter vanished, plunging the grand estate into a primitive, terrifying darkness. The digital locks hissed as they engaged in a permanent fail-safe mode, effectively entombing them in the marble palace. Salvatore reached for his burner phone, but the screen remained black, remotely wiped. In the sudden, oppressive gloom, the only thing he could see was the faint shimmer of Keisha's silk gown. For the first time in his life, the patriarch felt the cold prickle of true fear. It wasn't the darkness of the room that terrified him. It was the realization that the woman he had treated as a shadow was the one who had finally turned out the lights. "What have you done?" he whispered into the void. Keisha stepped closer, her footsteps silent on the Persian rug. The restrained emotional pain he had ignored for years had finally hardened into a diamond-sharp resolve. "I didn't do this tonight, Salvatore. I've been doing this since the day you told me my only value was my silence." In the darkness, the empire didn't fall with a bang. It fell with the soft, steady breathing of a woman who was finally, for the first time in 3 years, completely free. The silence in the grand hall of the Marcello estate was no longer the respectful hush of an empire. It was the hollow stillness of a tomb. Salvatore sat in his high-backed leather chair, the shadows stretching across the marble floor like grasping fingers. For the first time in his 68 years, the man known as the patriarch looked his age. His tailored suit, once armor, now seemed to hang heavy on a frame weakened by the sudden evaporation of his power. The heavy oak doors creaked open. Keisha walked in, her footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, steady confidence that Salvatore had never bothered to notice before. She didn't hurry. She didn't tremble. She stopped exactly 3 feet from him, standing in a pool of moonlight that cut through the darkness of the room. Her posture was regal, her expression a mask of restrained, dignified strength. Salvatore looked up, his eyes bloodshot and searching. "The accounts are empty, Keisha," he rasped, his voice cracking. "The warehouses in Sicily, the shipments in the harbor. The feds were waiting at every turn. They knew things only I should know." He leaned forward, desperation flickering in his gaze. "Who did this? Tell me who betrayed us." Keisha looked down at him, her eyes reflecting the cold, cinematic light of the room. There was no malice in her gaze, only the devastating clarity of a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows. "You kept looking for a traitor in your inner circle, Salvatore. You looked at your captains, your brothers, and your rivals." She paused, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "But you never looked at me. Even when I was holding your coat, even when I was pouring your wine, I was invisible to you." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Salvatore's hand shook as he reached for the glass on his desk. "You," he whispered. "Why?" "Because you thought you bought a ghost to settle a debt," Keisha replied, her voice smooth and unwavering. "You ignored my heart until it turned to stone, and you ignored my mind until it became a weapon. You built an empire on the silence of people you thought were beneath you." She leaned in, the shadows of the room framing her like a new queen ascending a ruined throne. "I didn't just leak your secrets, Salvatore. I became them. Your empire isn't gone. It's just under new management." Salvatore reached out, perhaps to grab her hand or perhaps to plead, but Keisha stepped back, reclaiming her space. In that moment, the power imbalance that had defined their 3-year marriage shattered forever. He was a billionaire with no currency. She was a woman with no more secrets. As she turned to leave him in the dark, she didn't look back. She had spent a lifetime being a shadow, but tonight, she was the only light left in the room. The heavy oak doors of the Marcello library creaked shut, sealing Salvatore into a tomb of his own making. Outside, the sirens were a distant, rhythmic wail, closing in on the estate like a tightening noose. Salvatore sat behind his desk, his hand trembling as he reached for the glass of vintage scotch he'd poured to steady his nerves. He looked every bit the 68-year-old man he was, haggard, his power stripped away like rotted bark from a dying tree. When he looked up, Keisha was standing in the center of the room. She wasn't wearing the diamonds he'd bought to brand her as his property, nor the submissive veil of silence she had worn for 3 long years. She stood tall, her posture dignified and dangerously calm, illuminated by the flickering firelight that cast long, sharp shadows across the room. "Where is the money, Keisha?" Salvatore's voice was a rasping shadow of its former authority. "The accounts are empty, the Caymans, the Swiss holdings, gone. What have you done?" Keisha didn't flinch. She took a slow step forward, her eyes reflecting the high-contrast cinematic glow of the room. "I didn't just take the money, Salvatore. I took the ledgers. I took the shipping manifests. I took the names of every senator you've bought and every rival you've buried." Salvatore let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "You were a debt, Keisha, a girl from nothing. I gave you this life. I gave you my name." "You didn't give me a name," she replied, her voice smooth and cold as marble. "You gave me a cage. You ignored me because you thought I was a ghost, a quiet shadow that would never have the heart to strike back. But ghosts are the only ones who can walk through walls, Salvatore. While you were looking over your shoulder for an army, you forgot to look at the woman sleeping beside you." She placed a single, digital drive on the desk between them, the final nail in his coffin. "You called me your secret wife," she whispered, leaning down until she was eye level with the man who had tried to break her. "But I was never your wife. From the moment I stepped into this house, I was your end." Salvatore reached out, his fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve, a desperate final plea for the loyalty he had never earned. But Keisha pulled away with a look of restrained pity. The sound of the front doors being kicked and echoed through the mansion. The patriarch was dead. The woman he had dismissed was the only one left standing in the ruins of his empire. She turned her back on him and walked toward the light of the hallway, leaving the shadows behind forever. The dusty winds of Sicily swept through the open terrace of the Marcello estate, but the man who had built it sat in the center of the ruins like a ghost. Salvatore Marcello, once the patriarch, looked every bit of his 68 years. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his silver hair unkempt, and the fire that had once terrified world leaders had been reduced to a flickering ember of regret. He stared at the empty seat across from him, finally seeing the woman who was no longer there. He had ignored her for 3 years, treating her like a piece of furniture in his grand design. Now he realized that while he was playing a game of checkers with blood and bullets, Keisha had been playing a game of shadows with his soul. She hadn't just taken his money, she had taken his relevance. Every contact, every ledger, and every loyalty he thought he owned had been quietly transferred into the hands of a woman he didn't even know how to talk to. A shadow fell over the stone floor. Salvatore looked up, his heart stuttering with a hope he didn't deserve, but it wasn't the submissive girl he'd married. Keisha Vance stood before him, her posture regal and her expression carved from the same diamond-hard resolve she had hidden for years. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that caught the Mediterranean light, standing not apart from the power, but as the very source of it. She didn't look at him with hatred. That would have required a passion she no longer felt for him. She looked at him with the quiet dignity of a victor. "The accounts are closed, Salvatore," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the restrained pain that had once defined her. "The men have been paid, the assets have been liquidated, and the Marcello name is officially a relic of the past." Salvatore's lip trembled. "I would have given you the world, Keisha, if you had only asked." "You never would have given it," she replied, stepping toward the edge of the terrace to look out over the empire she had dismantled and rebuilt in her own image. "Because you never believed I was real enough to hold it. You didn't lose your empire because of a rival or a bullet. You lost it because you couldn't see the woman standing right in front of you." She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing with a finality that signaled the end of an era. Salvatore reached out a hand, but he was too slow, too old, and too late. He was left with his shattered heart in a kingdom of rubble. While Keisha walked into the sunlight, no longer a secret, no longer a debt, but a queen who had finally found the courage to claim her own destiny. The silence she left behind was no longer a cage, it was her throne. Keisha's story is a powerful testament to the fact that you should never mistake silence for weakness. Salvatore Marcello spent a lifetime building walls of stone and steel, only to realize that the greatest threat wasn't an army at his gates, it was the woman he chose to ignore. This story reminds us that when we underestimate others, we give them the ultimate weapon, the element of surprise. Keisha didn't just destroy an empire, she reclaimed a life that had been stolen from her. If this story of strength and strategic reversal moved you, please hit that like button and share this with anyone who has ever felt overlooked or undervalued. Comment below with the word empire if you believe in the power of the underdog. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never miss a journey about the moments when the quietest voice becomes the loudest.